The night was not merely silent, it was suffocating, like the breath of the world itself had been stolen. A crimson glow bathed the horizon as flames devoured the village one home at a time. The air trembled with the sound of collapse, wooden beams splitting, thatched roofs falling, and screams rising like prayers that would never reach heaven. Mothers clutched their infants to their chests, running barefoot through mud soaked with ash. The sky was painted with smoke, and in that darkness, every cry was swallowed. Every heartbeat echoed like a plea to a god who seemed to have turned away. In the distance, the thunder of hooves approached, not nature's storm, but man's. The storm of war. From beyond the hills, shadows emerged, tall, cloaked, and merciless. The moon, half veiled by clouds, revealed flashes of steel and armor glinting like the eyes of predators. The Ottomans rode in formation, their torches blazing, reflecting in their helmets like halos of fire. The ground shook beneath the rhythm of their horses. They did not speak, they did not need to. Their silence carried authority. Behind them, banners fluttered, marked by the empire's crescent. Before them lay helpless souls, whose only sin was being born in the path of conquest. As the first spear struck the village gate, time itself seemed to freeze, the moment before horror becomes reality. The gates broke with a single crash that echoed like the death knell of peace. Men charged out with axes and pitchforks, their courage born not of strength but desperation. For every swing they took, 10 more blades met them. The earth grew slick with blood, and the smell of burning thatch filled every breath. Children hid under carts, whispering their fathers' names, while mothers wept silently, not from fear, but from the knowledge that this was the end. Dogs barked until they were silenced. The church bell rang once, then again, and then no more. When the sun finally rose, it shone on ruins, not of stone and wood, but of a people erased. Bound by ropes that dug into their wrists, the women were herded together like livestock. Their dresses, torn and blackened by soot, clung to them in tatters. The soldiers spoke in a language they could not understand, yet cruelty needed no translation. Some women begged, some prayed, some stared blankly at the corpses of their husbands. There was no order, no mercy, only the mechanical rhythm of soldiers counting their captives. A young girl tried to hide beneath her mother's skirt. A soldier dragged her out, laughing. The world had become a theater of grief, and the captives, unwilling performers in its endless tragedy. As they were led away, their village still burned behind them, the smoke rising like a final farewell to innocence. Days turned into nights, nights into endless gray dawns. The road wound across mountains and valleys, but all paths led to the same place, suffering. Their feet were blistered, their throats dry. The rain fell cold and merciless, mixing with tears and blood. Some stumbled and never rose again. The soldiers did not stop. They simply loosened the ropes and left the fallen behind for the crows. At times, the women sang softly, songs of home, of mothers and harvests, but their voices cracked before the verses could end. Even the sky seemed to mourn, its clouds heavy with sorrow. And yet, somewhere inside, a faint flame of endurance burned, fragile but alive. For even when the world turned its back, the will to live remained the last rebellion. When they reached the empire's city, the smell hit them before the sight did, a mix of spice, sweat, and despair. The slave market was not hidden. It stood proudly at the heart of the capital, where traders shouted prices louder than priests prayed. The women were stripped of dignity and name. They stood in lines beneath the scorching sun while wealthy men examined their faces, their hands, even their teeth, as if testing the worth of cattle. Some were too weak to stand and were kicked aside, discarded like broken goods. Coins changed hands with laughter. A mother reached for her daughter as they were torn apart, her screams drowned beneath the sound of bargaining voices. And as the bells of the marketplace rang, the world pretended not to hear. Those judged beautiful enough were taken to the palace, a golden labyrinth where every wall gleamed, but every corner hid sorrow. Silk draperies veiled the windows, and fountains whispered in marble halls, but behind those walls, freedom had no name. Servants spoke in whispers, and every step echoed like the memory of chains. The Sultan's court was a theater of luxury built upon the tears of the conquered. The women were bathed in rose water, perfumed, and taught to smile, not out of joy, but survival. They became ornaments of power, each one a silent reflection of someone else's sin. There were rooms within that palace that the world never saw, places where candles burned through the night and laughter disguised cruelty. The forbidden chambers smelled of wine and sorrow. Music played softly, not to celebrate, but to drown the sound of weeping. The women were adorned like jewels, paraded before men who spoke of conquest while drinking from cups of gold. To the empire, they were trophies, reminders of victory. To themselves, they were fading souls, learning how to die slowly without ever closing their eyes. Each night they prayed, not for freedom, but simply for forgetfulness. But not all bowed their heads. Some still carried fire in their hearts, the kind that no empire could extinguish. A few tried to flee through hidden corridors or poison the guards who hurt them. When caught, the punishment was public, brutal, and meant to break spirits. They were paraded through the courtyards, their cries echoing across marble and stone. Yet even as lashes tore their flesh, they stared back at their captors, eyes filled not with fear, but defiance. That gaze haunted the guards for nights, because deep down, they knew, chains can hold the body, but never the will. Among the captives was an old woman, her back bent by years, her eyes still glowing like embers. She was not beautiful by the world's standards, so she was ignored, a mistake the empire would regret. At night, when the guards grew drunk, she whispered to the younger women stories of home, of fields, laughter, rivers that glowed at dusk. Her words painted pictures brighter than gold, and in those stories, the women found fragments of themselves again. She taught them songs of strength and hope, tales of ancestors who had survived worse. The empire believed they had silenced them, but her stories became rebellion, carried on the breath of the broken, spreading like wildfire through whispers. Among the captives was a girl of 16, eyes like dusk, voice soft as a prayer. She caught the Sultan's attention with a single glance, and from that day forward, her life ceased to be her own. She was given jewels, silks, and a new name, one that erased who she had been. In the court, they called her fortunate, but behind her quiet eyes lived the shadow of grief. She smiled when ordered, spoke when spoken to, and at night, stared through the lattice windows at a sky that no longer felt hers. In her silence, she carried the ghost of her mother, the scent of her village, and the weight of a past that refused to die. Within those walls, pain became a language the captives understood without words. Slowly, they found each other, not through speech, but through shared glances, gestures, and the quiet touch of hands in passing. They began to help one another, hiding scraps of bread, passing messages through embroidery patterns, singing coded songs that guards couldn't understand. They were women from different lands and languages, yet suffering made them sisters. Together, they formed an invisible bond stronger than any chain, a quiet rebellion that grew in the dark beneath the empire's very nose. It began with whispers, then courage, then blood. One night, as the moon hung red and heavy in the sky, the women moved silently through the palace. A servant slipped poison into a cup meant for a cruel master. Another cut through a guard's throat with a hidden blade sewn into her dress. The air was thick with fear and determination. They knew they wouldn't live to see morning, but they fought not for life, but for dignity. The palace became a battlefield without war cries, only the sound of breath, silk, and steel. For the first time, the empire trembled from within, not because of armies, but because of women who refused to kneel. Amidst the chaos, a handful of women fled into the night. The palace, once a prison, now burned behind them. They ran barefoot through forests, guided only by the stars. Their lungs burned, their feet bled, but every step was a prayer. Behind them came the distant sound of horns, the hunters released. Yet, for the first time in years, the air they breathed was their own. Even if dawn would bring death, at least they would meet it free. One of them looked back once, not in regret, but in defiance, and whispered, "They will remember us." But freedom is fragile. Among them was one who could not bear the thought of capture, who feared pain more than slavery. In her panic, she betrayed them, revealing their hiding place to the soldiers. The air filled once again with screams and the clash of steel. The forest became a trap, the darkness alive with violence. Those who had run were dragged back, their faces covered in dirt and tears. And yet, even as chains were thrown around them once more, they did not beg. Their silence stung the empire harder than any blade. For silence, when born of pride, can shake kingdoms. They were brought before the Sultan, accused of rebellion. The punishment was swift and cruel beyond words. Each was to be executed at dawn, their names erased, their stories buried. Yet when the guards demanded pleas for mercy, the women stood unmoving. One by one, they faced their end with heads held high. Their eyes met the horizon, where the first light of morning broke, and in that light, they found peace. The empire had their bodies, but not their souls. Their defiance became legend, one not written in books, but carried in whispers from generation to generation. In the months that followed, one woman gave birth in a hidden corner of the palace, a daughter born beneath the weight of chains. Her mother died, bringing her into the world, whispering her final words, "Live free." The child grew, silent and strong, raised by the same women who had once fought beside her mother. Her eyes held the memory of all that had been lost, and all that must be remembered. To the empire, she was just another servant. But in her heart burned a story of fire, blood, and survival, the legacy of those who refused to be forgotten. Outside the walls of the palace, far from marble and silk, the earth hid countless graves. No names marked them. No prayers were spoken. The wind blew gently through the fields where the forgotten slept. Women whose lives ended in chains, but whose spirits refused to rest. Travelers said that, on quiet nights, if you stood still enough, you could hear their voices in the wind, not crying, but singing. Singing of home, of freedom, of vengeance. Because the dead, when wronged, do not stay silent forever. Centuries passed, kingdoms rose and fell, and the palaces crumbled to dust. But the suffering of those women never truly faded. It lingered in the bloodlines of survivors, in stories whispered to daughters before sleep, in songs that sounded more like mourning than music. The empire may have forgotten their names, but history never did. Every war, every raid, every act of cruelty still carries the echo of their pain. Their ghosts walk among us still, not to haunt, but to remind. To remind the world what happens when power forgets compassion. And so, even after centuries, the story lives, in ashes, in silence, in the wind. They were never given graves, never honored as martyrs. Yet they became something greater, a warning, a truth carved into time itself. Their voices call out still, faint but unbroken, telling us that cruelty does not die with the cruel, and that every soul lost to oppression becomes a storm waiting to rise again. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, nameless to history, but eternal in spirit. Their suffering was meant to be erased, but in the end, it became unforgettable.